Q&A to hear about some other parts
Okay,
of the
wonderful.
research.
Okay, so I think we can get started since it's 5:30. So I'm going to start formally now.
Okay.
So welcome to everyone who's joining us this afternoon for another one of the Department of Political Science at the University of São Paulo's seminar series. Today, it's a wonderful honor for us to have Professor Jennifer McCoy from Georgia State University, who is coming to speak with us about pernicious polarization's harm to democracy and what we can do about it. And before turning over for Professor McCoy to give her presentation, I just wanted to provide a brief introduction to her career and her work. Jennifer McCoy is a professor of political science at Georgia State University. In 2019, she was the Senior Core Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. She was named a GSU Distinguished University Professor in the inaugural class of 2013, and she served as the Director of the Global Studies Institute from 2015 to 2016. Prior to this, Dr. McCoy served as the Director of the Carter Center Americas program from 1998 to 2015, leading projects on democratic strengthening, mediation and dialogue, and hemispheric cooperation. A specialist on democratization and polarization, mediation and conflict prevention, election processes and observation, and Latin American politics, Dr. McCoy has authored or edited 6 books and dozens of articles. Her latest volume is Polarizing Polities, a Global Threat to Democracy, which is co-edited with Murat Sommer and was published in 2019. At Georgia State University, she teaches courses on democratic erosion, comparative democratization, international norms, and Latin American politics. So Dr. McCoy, it's really a wonderful honor to have you in the department and to welcome you to Brazil virtually. Thank you very much for joining us and for agreeing to present your work in the seminar series. We're very honored to have you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn over the floor to you.
All right, thank you, Lorena. It's wonderful to join you all, even though it's not in person. And of course, Brazil itself is a very interesting country to look at in terms of this theme, which I have not applied the framework to Brazil yet, but I'd be very interested to hear your comments. So let me share screen. And on full screen. Okay. So what I want to talk to you about is basically my research program that I've been working on for the last 5 or 6 years, which is about the dangers of us versus them polarization for democracy and what to do about it. And so what I want to do is present kind of very briefly the theory of pernicious polarization that Somer and I have developed, focusing on the dynamics of it, the causes and consequences, and then what are the consequences for democracy. And here there's some of the empirical, qualitative, and quantitative analysis that I have done collaboratively with a number of people. And then I'm going to present the micro foundations level. So the consequences for democracy part and is case studies and empirical statistical analysis. So at the country level, but I've also at the macro level. So I've also done some research at the micro foundation, some experimental research on polarization and democratic erosion in the United States and Hungary. And then I thought I would take a discussion break and kind of hear your comments and questions. And then if there's time and interest, then I have more I could present. And so it sort of depends on your interests on the opposition strategies. And that some of that is in that article that was distributed, the democratization article, which again is the macro qualitative level at the country level. And then I do have an experiment on antidotes to the antipathy that comes with pernicious polarization, that we tried some solutions, an experiment that I could present if you are interested, and if we have time. So there's a lot. So I'm giving you kind of a brief overview of this larger program rather than a single paper. So the volumes that Lorena was mentioning, we produced 2 volumes of work edited by Marat Sumer and myself. The most recent one that Lorena mentioned was this Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. And so that one is a series of case studies, of a dozen case studies, where we invited scholars from around the world to analyze cases that were arriving to pernicious polarization. So, because the idea was to try and identify the causal mechanisms of this dynamic. And so these were all cases that were experiencing some level of pernicious polarization. And we wanted to understand the dynamics of it, the logic of it, and then the consequences for democracy. As part of that group of about a dozen scholars, we also produced, prior to that, another volume in 2018 in the American Behavioral Scientist, which had some empirical chapters, comparative chapters, some theoretical, and some other empirical work, some theory chapters. So this part is coming from those 2 volumes, this part of the talk. So what is pernicious polarization? As we have defined it, it's a severe form of political polarization that simplifies politics. And in it, society divides into 2 mutually distrustful political camps, and the normally cross-cutting differences that we see particularly in a democracy, are consolidated instead into 2 camps based on a single line dividing the society. So we get this us versus them quality of it. So at the political dimension, the effects, the characteristics are that people do sort into like-minded groups. The center drops out. So we have a polarization between 2 camps that would be a centrifugal pull to the extremes. And people begin to view politics as a zero-sum game. And what happens in political competition is that the normal political adversaries that used to be simply a competition, particularly an electoral competition every 4 or 5 years, now become enemies to be eliminated. But it also extends into the society. And citizens actually divide spatially and socially. And so we see this happening in a case like Caracas, Venezuela, where the city itself was divided between the Chavista side and the non-Chavista side, particularly buildings. I was mediating there with President Carter, for example, in the early 2000s at the height of the political conflict, and simply trying to find a place to meet, to bring the 2 sides together for any kind of dialogue or negotiation was very tricky, because even every building, every location was identified with one side or the other, and therefore rejected by the other side as a place to meet. So it gets to that extent. And we have, as any of you who might be studying affective polarization is a key part of this. And it draws on social identity theory from social psychology. And in any kind of intergroup conflict, we see a lot of stereotyping and prejudice as people generalize, stereotype, and they deem their own group in much more positive terms, and they overestimate the positive characteristics of their own group, and they deem the out group in very negative terms. And the 2 camps then end up viewing the other as actually posing an existential threat to their way of life. Okay, so this is kind of a simple description, a quick description of the concept that we saw by studying a variety of countries. But what you'll see from this is that we are taking the term polarization from, particularly in American political science, what had been developed was especially ideological polarization. So when the term is used in American political science, it often refers to simply distance on issues. So it's an ideological or issue-based definition of polarization is the conventional term. And the measure is simply how far apart are political parties, how far apart are voters in their attitudes on these issues. So what we said is that is actually just a distance measure of attitudes. What we're talking about when we get this kind of separation that rises to a pernicious level has more characteristics. So it becomes a social identity. The political partisan identity becomes a social identity with these social psychological characteristics that I described. And it has the affective polarization part to it. And so it is, and it can be on various, the divides can be identified and the underlying, the polarizing cleavage or issue may vary. And so it's not just a left-right divide as we were measuring with the ideological polarization measure. So we realized that in trying to look at what we were seeing, left-right, when you're doing it cross-nationally, doesn't mean the same thing in different countries, doesn't mean the same thing in different, to different people. And so what we said was that it's, what we saw was the divide could be urban versus rural interests. It could be national versus cosmopolitan or globalist. It could be simply in favor of a leader, like pro-Chavez versus anti-Chavez could be the defining feature. It could be populism, the people versus the elites. So whatever the divide was characterized by was usually we could identify a kind of rhetorical narrative that was being built to create this divide. And then we also see that it plays multiple roles. So political strategy, polarization can be a political strategy. A political actor, a party, a candidate, a politician can use a polarizing strategy to gain or retain power by creating these binary choices of us versus them. Okay, so they're using it in the narrative, in the messaging that they're giving to people, and in the strategy of how they're building their coalitions and providing these choices. And they themselves may have either benign or malicious ends, democratic or authoritarian aims. They can, either one can use a polarizing strategy. And most politicians know that usually polarization is a winning electoral strategy. It's easy to win elections with a polarizing strategy. But it's also a process. And so what we saw is that polarization is this moving creation of the camps in the simplification of politics, deliberately, attempting to weaken the cross-cutting ties and simplifying politics around it by identifying two opposing immovable blocks. And as that process deepens, it can raise to the level of pernicious. And when it reaches that level, then it becomes a condition. Pernicious polarization is a condition. It's like an equilibrium that it reaches. And so we can have levels of polarization that we would not identify as having yet reached the pernicious level. So when we think about this in terms of the original definition or the kind of conventional approach, as I said, the ideological polarization as divides between people, what we're talking about is, or actually this whole process is a natural inherent part of democratic politics. So we know that democratic politicians, political parties have to differentiate themselves from the other. And so they are going to create something, a narrative about ourselves versus their opponents. But what we're talking about is going further in this when we have all of these characteristics that I've described, that it becomes pernicious. And when that happens, we look at the endogenous nature of it. The process of polarization itself changes political actors. It creates pernicious incentives and it emboldens the extremes. So what we see happening is within an actor, within a political party or a coalition or a group, that the more extreme voices are more vocal and are heard. And anybody who tries to be a bridge, anyone who tries to restore those cross-cutting ties or to be a negotiator or a bridge builder becomes accused of being a traitor or a sellout. And so they are moving apart. So we see a chain reaction, and this is how it harms democracy. So we see actors using polarizing strategies, which creates this us versus them tribal logic with these social psychological attributes of the mutual distrust, dislike, and bias, which then engenders an existential threat that people view that if the other side comes to power or stays in power, it is an existential threat to my way of life or to the nation. And because of that, then we see support for democratic norm violations. People are willing to tolerate the violation of democracy to keep their actor, their side, their camp in power, or to gain power for their side, or prevent the other side from gaining. Okay, so the relationship with democracy, as I said, there's some level is natural to democracy. And it's not that polarization is necessarily always bad. Disruptive polarization may be necessary to create positive change for social justice or democratization. The trick for disruptive polarization is how to do it without creating the identity and without using the demonizing rhetoric that is going to, and using the identity strategy that is going to drive people apart, but instead to focus on values such as social justice or democratization. And what we see is that polarization can be either a cause of democratic change, that is moving a country toward more democratization or less democratization, or it could also be the consequence of democratic change. Okay, so in some empirical, so that's kind of the theory about it. The empirical analysis is this article that I think was distributed to you all in Democratization, in which we did a couple of things. But what we did first was a statistical analysis using the VDIM data that they have. What makes it really easy to now use is their variable on political polarization, which is very, very close to, and I think drawn on some of our work, very close to our definition of dividing the society, and it extends into the society into two mutual hostile, distrustful camps. So this is now available as of the last year. And so that really helps, because before people would say, how are you going to measure it? How are you going to identify it? And we had to use a number of different, and that's why we were doing qualitative research, because there wasn't a single number to use. So we used that, and then we used, so we just did regression analysis with various lags and various groups, various hypotheses here to look at the effects on democracy using VDIM's liberal democracy score. And so of our three hypotheses, the first was that increased polarization decreases the quality of liberal democracy in a state. And we did find support for that. Yes. Second one was an increased rate of polarization. So we wanted to look at the speed of polarization. So a very rapid polarization we thought would disproportionately also hurt the quality of liberal democracy. We did not find support for that hypothesis. But we did for our third, which was the level of polarization. So this is where we're saying when it reaches this level that we call pernicious, severe, and it's sustained for 5 years or more, does decrease, disproportionately decreases the quality of liberal democracy. So we now have some empirical evidence at the cross-national level to kind of support our theory of the way this was working and our qualitative work. So then I wanted to also look at this at the individual level to see if we could find empirical evidence that this process, this chain that I described, actually worked at the individual voter level as well. And so I did an experiment. I'm doing some experimental work with 2 colleagues from Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. And that's what I want to show you now. So we were, started with this puzzle of why citizens who say they're supportive of democracy in general tolerate or even encourage the erosion of existing democratic norms. So we were thinking of Viktor Orban in Hungary, of Republicans for Trump in the United States, of supporters of Erdogan in Turkey. We could think about Brazil as well, and drawing on the work that Graham and Shvolik did and published last year in the APSR as well. They were doing some work on this to find out why and when citizens would tolerate these democratic norms. So our theory was that, so I said, looking at the prior research, our own qualitative work was that intense partisan polarization, this pernicious polarization, will harm it. And because of this perception of a zero-sum game and existential threat. But there's also survey research that shows that conservatives support more authoritarian leadership and policies than liberals. So there's various survey research, and in our survey we found that as well. And then there's the experimental research showing that polarized voters will trade off democratic norms to retain their preferred policies. So that's the Graham and Shvolik, and there was another experiment by Stoley et al. That they did one in Canada that found similar things. But what we thought was that there were some unanswered questions, and that is, when you look at survey research, that indicates that the ideology or elite cues can determine variation in democratic attitudes of voters. So listening to elites, to political elites, or that the ideology of the person. As we said, it looks like conservatives were more authoritarian than liberals. But the experimental research indicated that polarization could lead citizens of either the left or the right to support anti-democratic parties. Shvolik had done one in Venezuela, for example, and was looking at the supporters of Hugo Chavez here. So we asked, does the political context of who is in power influence the research findings at any given time? And because most of these surveys were done, for example, in the US when Trump was in office. And so it's hard to tell if it's just because of the elite cues of Republicans following Trump's messages about the need to not pay attention to courts or to Congress, or whether it was one of these other reasons. So we proposed this theoretical proposition about democratic hypocrisy. And that is that support for democratic norms are conditioned on one's preferences for the office holder. In other words, is my party, are my co-partisans in power or in the opposition? If my party is in power, then I will be we hypothesize I will be more likely to support the violation of democratic norms to keep them in power. If I'm in the opposition, I don't want to see the violation of democratic norms. So, and we thought this is exacerbated by affective partisan polarization. And so we came up with two ways to measure this. One is using, there's a battery of questions by Huddy, Mason, and Arrow on partisan social identity to see to what extent somebody's partisan attachment or partisan identity also becomes a social identity. And then the second was our theory about threat. So how much distrust and what are the perceptions of threat of the out party, of the other party, do people have? So we thought that these two measures would exacerbate this democratic hypocrisy and help explain it. So we expect this is going to happen in polarized contexts. So our research design was to say we need to manipulate rather than observe the political context of who is in power. Because if we can't change that in our experiment, we have to wait until a new administration comes in. We have to wait until the political context changes. And so that was the problem with the US work. Most of it was done during the Trump years. And so we said, well, because many people said, oh, Democrats would do the same thing if they were in office. So like getting rid of the filibuster for the Supreme Court justices, if you read anything about that, Republicans said, oh, Democrats would do the same thing. So we said, how could we test this without waiting for the election that we weren't sure, who would win? So our design was to manipulate who is in power. So we had two treatments. One group of respondents to our survey received the scenario that Democrats have swept the 2020 elections. That is, they've won. They're now in office in the presidency, Congress, and your state governor. And the other is Republicans have won all of these branches of government. Okay, so voters are divided, respondents are divided into two groups, and they get one of these scenarios. And this is looking at the experimental design. So after some attention checks, we had pre-treatment questions. We gave them that battery for the partisan identity intensity, and we gave them questions about out-party threat. So that was pre-treatment because we wanted to see how much those were going to moderate the relationship. And then we divided them into the two groups, the two scenarios. And what we did was we gave them a range. The dependent variables were 16 democratic policy choices. So they had 16 little stories about what is a policy choice that the leader has to make and which would you support. So for example, do you think that the new president, and remember they've either gotten it's either going to be a Democratic president or a Republican president. The new president in the election, this is all before the election, is should the new president, if they believe the courts are biased against them, should they ignore rulings by courts? Would be one example. So we gave them a range of choices like that ranged from, some of them were actually constitutional, like should the president and the new Congress change the number of Supreme Court justices? Now that's absolutely constitutional. They are allowed to do that. It's just changing a norm that's existed for 100 years, that there are 9 Supreme Court justices in the United States. And of course, because the Democrats viewed the Republicans of having used very malicious means to manipulate, that they got to name 3 under President Trump, then the Democrats, there was a big push from Democratic supporters to expand the number so Democrats could name more. So they range from constitutional choices to others that are more unconstitutional, such as violating someone's civil rights, free speech, or prosecuting journalists for giving negative reports on the president, or suppressing protesters. So it was a national survey. We did it online, about 3,000 people. We did it in March, and then we followed up. We have 2 studies, one in March and one in August. And we did Democrats and Republicans. So our first hypothesis was citizens are more supportive of democratic norm erosion when co-partisans are in power. And we did find confirmation of that. And here are the results. So the full sample increases almost 7% when co-partisans are in power. So on this range of 16 questions, we made an index out of that, and it increased what we call democratic hypocrisy increased by 7%. We also found, that's this 6.7. We also found that Republicans increase at least 50% more than Democrats. So here, Democrats about 5%, Republicans almost 9%. If you just look at the average percent choice, how many, what percentage of these 16 norm eroding policies each one chose when their own party was in power versus when they're out party. So this is just the percentages of their choices. Then what you see is that both parties do increase when their in party is in power. So they both have democratic hypocrisy. But Republicans start out at a higher level, whether they're in or out of power, because you see they're at 40 when they're in power, 40% of the questions they answered yes. And even when they're out of power, they answer 31%. Democrats were lower on both scores. So the second hypothesis, did those who, this was a pre-treatment question, did those who had higher perceptions of out-group threat and who had this strong partisan attachment or identity increase support for democratic norm erosion when their co-partisans are in power? Yes, we saw that partisan identity intensity especially did moderate the relationship. It increased it more. For out-group threat, it only increased it for Republicans. Okay, so we thought that was interesting. So we decided we need to test experimentally out-group threat, because this would then be observational as a moderating variable, and so we couldn't really attribute causation. So we decided we want to really test out-group threat. It's hard to manipulate partisan identity. We couldn't manipulate it experimentally, but we could try to manipulate out-group threat. So that's what we tried to do in our study 2. So this is the one in August. So we replicated study 1. We just used 5 of those 16 democratic policy choices. We added a second arm to manipulate the out-group threats by asking them, list a few things that make you feel threatened about Democrats or Republicans, whichever one they're not, and then write them down. And then what things make others who also support your party feel threatened about the other party? So we're trying to prime threat by having them think about this and write it down. So this experiment had 2 arms plus the control. So basically 2 by 2 plus 1, if any of you have done experiments. So we had a threat prime, and then we had a group who didn't have a threat prime, control group. We had a control group that had no winner scenarios, no prime at all, because we wanted to see kind of what's the baseline that they would answer. Just right now, you ask them these democratic policy choices. What do they answer? Without the scenarios and without the threat prime. Then we divided them up, and so they get a threat prime or no threat prime, and then within those, then they're divided again, and some of them, half are getting the Republicans and half are getting the Democratic scenario. So here what you can see is the baseline with no treatments, and you see Republican is GOP here. So Republican is always the light. And you could see mostly they are higher, like banning protests. They're higher. Democrats are the dark. This one we kept independents in, so they're in the middle. Should the president be able to disqualify candidates who they think are not loyal to the country? Republicans said yes. This is like 45%, no, close to 50%. Democrats much lower. But this one, interesting. Should the president disregard courts they perceive as biased, as politically biased? This one, they're about even, Democrats and Republicans. Independents higher. I'm not sure about why. Now, packing the Supreme Court, we know Democrats should be more in favor of that because they feel aggrieved, as I said before. They didn't get to name these justices. They thought it was unfair what the Republicans did. So this is very logical that Democrats want to do that, Republicans don't. Prosecuting journalists who write negative stories about you, Republicans more in favor. So overall, Republicans and independents start out, so baseline, stronger Democratic erosion than Democrats. Then in terms of our experiment, so here's the results. So the party in power is down here. So if you're in party in power, first, so these are, they're getting both of the scenarios. This is no threat prime. So this would be like the control for the threat prime. And this is, they get the threat prime. So those who are not getting the threat prime, they just get the scenarios. You're in party versus you're out party. And you can see that there is a difference here. It's about 2 points, a little over 2 point difference here for eroding attitudes. When we add the threat prime, we see that that democratic hypocrisy increases. It makes people, whenever they get the scenario that their in party is in power, their democratic erosion attitudes increase more. Okay, so we see a bigger, and their out party lessens. They want more democracy to counter. When they're out of power, they want more democracy to counter the power of those in power, is how we interpret this. And then for the moderator, so this one, we only have the partisanship as social identity, or what Huddy calls expressive partisanship as the moderator. And here you can see the effect. So those who have very low partisan attachment here are not going to have, it doesn't have much effect on their democratic hypocrisy, but those who have high partisan attachment, here is where we see a real effect. Okay, so there were some limitations to this. We had questions. We're working on an R&R on this for a journal. So we had questions. Can we actually eliminate the influence of the context that is really there? In other words, can voters actually comply with what we ask them to do and believe? Remember, this is back in August before the election of last November. Can they actually comply and imagine that a Democrat is in power when we gave them that scenario? Well, we said even if they couldn't, that would actually underestimate democratic hypocrisy. So we think that our results will probably be even greater when we have the chance to try it. Now, of course, Democrats won, not as strongly in the Senate or the House as expected, but they did, control all three. So we do plan to redo this again now in a couple of months here, so we can compare the context. The actual context of Republicans being in power could be distorting Republican democratic hypocrisy. So we're not trying to say right now that Republicans are definitely more hypocritical. And so what we did to try and validate it is we looked at some observational data, and we found from LaPop, based at Vanderbilt, Latin American public opinion surveys. They include the US. And so we looked at some longitudinal data across administrations with different parties in power from 2006, which was George W. Bush, to 2019, and found here this is over here in part B, that Republicans were overall, let's see, this is support for erosion across the administration. So Republican respondents, when a Republican was in power, they were much stronger than Democrats were. So that's our democratic hypocrisy supported across these administrations. In answer to the question there was one question about courts, disregarding courts. Democrat respondents also showed democratic hypocrisy. When a this is cut off. When a Democrat is in office, is the president, they showed more than Republicans. So they showed both more, comparing it over here to Democrats. No, sorry. So Democrats showed more than when a Republican was in office themselves, but they are less overall still than Republicans, but do show democratic hypocrisy. So conclusions that we have here is American democratic resilience is fragile. Public opinion cannot be counted on to stop democratic erosion. The intense partisan polarization coming from partisan social identity and perceptions about group threat appear to be contributing. And this is the first study to manipulate who is in power and to manipulate threat perceptions of the out party in power. But we will test it when Democrats are actually in power as they are now, so mid-year this year. We did replicate this in Hungary, and this is just from a pilot. I'll just show you what we did just a couple of months ago. We saw this again for the in-party in power, for government supporters. When the in-party's in power, they support norm erosion much more than imagining the scenario of the out-party being in power. And also opposition members, current opposition members, show if they get the scenario that their party comes to power, then they're much more norm eroding than they are now when Viktor Orban is in power. So we see even stronger result in Hungary for this theory of democratic hypocrisy. Again, same thing, that expressive partisanship works as a moderator. So what I wanted to do is kind of stop there and see if you have comments, questions, ideas on this part, and see, how long that discussion goes. And then if you are interested, I can move on to the overcoming polarization. There's another article, but also some of the stuff in this democratization about opposition strategies, and the failed experiment on, the antidotes. It was a failed experiment to overcome affective polarization, but we did some pretty interesting qualitative content analysis trying to understand what happened to the mechanisms. So let me stop now and turn it back to you, Lorena, and see where you want to go.
Great. So we have a audience that's joining us, and as I explained in the chat, we really want to welcome questions and comments, and we have a tradition in the department. We really want to encourage students to speak up and to ask questions and discuss research, because that's part of training them into the discipline. So we have a tradition that we usually leave the first questions for students in the department to ask. And but what I would like to ask, if anybody has additional questions, if you can raise your hand, if you can, or you can send if you would like to ask your question live, you can raise your hand and I will call on you and allow you to speak. Or if not, we would appreciate it if you write your question in the Q&A and we discuss the question in the Q&A. And I'm going to give a chance for people to send their question. But one thing that I want to encourage is, even though we're virtual, we really want this to be a conversation. And so it's really important to have a conversation for people to participate. And we really hope you do send in your questions. So the first question, I see we have a first question, and there's actually two. And they're both from students in the department. So I'll read both of them, Jennifer, and maybe we can start with these. Moacir is asking, in the case of Brazil, we can consider that polarization follows the same pattern as the United States in the Trump years. President Bolsonaro has he followed the same steps as Trump? I think about the possibility of institutional rupture is more present than ever in Brazil, and that support for democracy is lower and institutions seem to be changing quickly. That's a first comment from Wasid. And if I can add a little bit to that, complementing a little bit what you were just speaking about with the US and the Hungarian case. One of the things that intrigues me about this theory and about thinking about pernicious polarization is thinking about its ties to authoritarian regimes and reversion to autocracy. So if we're thinking about Hungary or thinking about Latin America, where authoritarian regimes are a more recent regime that were, and we only have a few decades of transitioning towards democracy. I'm wondering if you've thought a little bit about how do we think about in a long-standing democracy such as the US, why would this surge, or why is this something latent that's always present and we're just detecting it now in this specific moment? So it's just, this is something ongoing. We recognize democratization is an ongoing process. It's never consolidated or complete. And as part of that ongoing process, you have to coexist with this latent erosion or challenge to the regime. Or is this something, and if you can talk a little bit about what inspired you guys to select the Hungarian versus the US case, what was the variation that you were hoping to explore? And then Henok, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, is asking, I would like to know if Professor McCoy and her colleagues also analyzed the effects of disinformation efforts promoted by foreign powers on polarization process. So we can that's an interesting question that we can also talk about in many Latin American countries. And then Marcelia is asking, Jennifer remembered the case of Venezuela in 2000. Two topics. I'm asking you lots of questions. No, I'm giving you.
I'm writing them down. Okay.
Okay. So if you want, maybe we'll come back to we'll do the first two questions and then we'll come back to the one on Venezuela, because I think there's a lot there to talk about, so we can get started. But thank you to everyone who's sending us questions. This is what we want. Okay.
Okay.
Jennifer.
Well, I should probably start by saying I came to this project because of Venezuela. And Marcela may know that. So because of I have studied Venezuela as a scholar for 35 years. And then also as working with President Carter, I became an election observer and then mediator in Venezuela observing the election that Hugo Chavez was first elected in 1999. From there, President Carter and I got to know him. So he asked us to come and mediate in 2002 after the attempted coup against him. So we continued that. And what I saw from, studying Venezuela since the 1980s was watching that country fall apart through polarization. And as I was, just witnessing that over these decades, but particularly after Chavez was elected, then I could see the same dynamics. And that's why I really saw the society dividing spatially. And as I said, families dividing, people, you couldn't go to the same restaurants. It became so negative that I was seeing similar dynamics in the United States, which really worried me. And I also saw them in other countries. And first I saw Egypt when Morsi was after Mubarak was overthrown, and then Mohammed Morsi was elected from the Muslim Brotherhood. And thinking about what was happening in Turkey, bringing in the religious, Muslims into government. What I started thinking was, this phenomenon is happening when marginalized groups, marginalized sectors of the population suddenly or finally come to power democratically. I was looking only at democracies. When they come to power democratically. And so Chavez bringing in the urban poor to power, representing them, saying he's representing them. Erdogan in Turkey with the Muslims, Morsi with the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power. And in the United States, it was really, well, let me just say first, and then what we saw as these marginalized groups were coming into power, often their leaders who had mobilized them did begin to act more, to operate with this polarizing strategy and more confrontational, but it created a backlash in each case from the prior elites. And there was a huge backlash in all of those cases. So Morsi was overthrown in a coup, Erdogan, various coup attempts, Chavez coup attempt. Okay, so how does that relate to the United States at all? Well, in the United States, Trump is simply a symptom and an outgrowth, but the polarization was happening much earlier. And it's a little bit, there's lots of different factors, and I think you have to look at every country like this to explain every country. But, and I want to get to this, I want to, then compare Trump with Bolsonaro, which I think is a great comparison. But I also compared Trump to Chavez. So I wrote an article about that too, before Trump was elected. In the United States, the marginalized group coming to power were Black Americans represented by Obama, that created a backlash in the Tea Party movement and the conservative movement, and that worked and that influenced the Republicans to work against Obama and to stop him. Republicans started acting in the Congress of the United States explicitly, and Mitch McConnell and congressional leaders said this explicitly: our goal is obstruction and to stop Obama from winning a second term. And so the similarity that I saw was this new group coming to power and creating a backlash. So in that case, it was racial. In the other cases, it could be class, like in Venezuela, or it could be religion, like in Turkey or Egypt. I, at the time, was looking for positive cases. What positive cases have brought in a marginalized group to political power for the first time? Well, we could say, so looking at Latin America, well, Bolivia, okay, the indigenous, under Evo Morales, that was pretty rough. That was very rocky. It was very polarized. If you remember, back in 2007, 2008, they were trying to write a new constitution. Media Luna was trying to secede, so it was very rough. Eventually, they worked out a modus vivendi under Morales and decreased the polarization. But I thought Brazil was the success story because Lula had brought in the Workers' Party, so bringing in workers, to the pinnacle of power, and it was pretty smooth, and everything was going really pretty well in the 2000s, especially with the commodity boom. So I was looking at that as a success story. You guys avoided extreme polarization in the first decade until Dilma came in. And commodity prices dropped and all kinds of, and then started to fall apart. And so I would ask Brazilianist scholars, colleagues, because I hadn't really, I'm not a specialist on Brazil. How do you see this polarization playing out? And they all told me, and I would be really interested to hear your feedback, you guys. But they said, it's not really polarized politically, the party, it's the multi-party system. Nobody can ever form a lasting coalition. It's always wheeling and dealing. And of course, then the corruption scandals that came from that. So it wasn't really polarized in the way I was talking about into two camps until recently, I think. And it certainly seemed to be through the whole Rousseff impeachment and then the successions and then the scandals growing. But was it polarizing in two camps? I'm not clear until perhaps now. And that's really, I want to look more into it, but I want to learn more about it. Bolsonaro certainly seemed to be following, to answer Moisette's question, the first person, certainly seemed to be following very similar strategies in terms of polarizing, us versus them, demonizing, insulting the opposition. And then also using kind of populist strategies of ignoring checks and balances, talking directly to the people. Trump with his Twitter feed following the Chavez strategies. Chavez didn't have Twitter at the beginning, but radio and talking directly to people and bypassing all news channels of filtering. So we don't have the filtering. And this gets to the little bit, well, it's not exactly disinformation, but the role of media, the role of social media. That question about the role of social media too, which seems to allow for more disinformation, but it actually is not new. Every new technology over history has introduced conspiracy theories and disinformation possibilities. So going back to the printing press, the invention of that allowed to print pamphlets that people could distribute and create misinformation and conspiracy theories. And then radio, well, I guess telegraph is in the middle, and then radio, and then cable news and opinion news, and then social media, Twitter today, and WhatsApp. I guess Brazil, it's really WhatsApp is the problem. So yeah, Trump and Bolsonaro share, I think, a lot in terms of strategies and this, disregard for the checks and balances and the polarization strategy. So institutional rupture, I guess Moises, I'm not sure if you were asking or you were predicting an institutional rupture coming. It certainly seems that that Brazil's is really in a fragile space. And one of another new project that I'm working on is democratic resilience. So what makes a country resilient? And some of it is institutions, but it is really, I think, the culture, the values, the norms, are they sustained? So I do agree, for example, with Levitsky and Zablat in How Democracies Die, and their work, saying that it's very important to whatever is written in the Constitution, whatever is written on paper, doesn't hold up. And all these people, my colleagues who study the United States for their whole career, just haven't looked at it in a comparative sense. And in the United States, it was comparativists who were raising the alarm about what was happening in the United States. It wasn't Americanists, those who studied US, because they didn't believe we could be a threat. So I don't know how you're feeling sitting in Brazil, if there's that same sense. But if you all who are studying international comparative politics and can see what these patterns are, may feel more threatened, that the country is more at risk than perhaps others who are only looking at Brazil. That was the case in the United States. It's really only now that Americanists are starting to say, that they're calling me all the time to say, what's the comparative perspective here? What's going to happen? And so this is new here. Okay, I'm going on a long time, so let me see. Why did we choose hungry established democracies? I'm starting now, Somera and I are starting a new book on depolarization. How do countries depolarize? Once they've reached the pernicious level, how do we depolarize? So we're trying to do a study, first looking statistically, what are the samples? We've just started this, and using the VDIM data, what it looks like is, first of all, countries go in cycles. As I said, Brazil, I thought was going to be the success story, and now it's falling apart, and polarization's going up, and democracy's being, weakened. Many countries are like that. And so is it latent, Lorena? all democracies are fragile, but what we want to identify is what are the conditions that make them some more resilient than others. But what we have seen is that depolarization happens often after war. So countries coming out of World War II, we saw immediate, especially in Europe, immediate depolarization. Countries coming out of civil war, civil violence, like Colombia after La Violencia, or transitions from military authoritarianism. You see it, Brazil in the measures. It's going way down after 1985, and then going way up. So you've got your big U shape. So it's cyclical, I think. And the factors range from structural, economic, that provide grievances for people, the information technology, so disinformation. Sure, that plays a role. I haven't studied it specifically. Hannick, I wrote down, Hannick, I think, asked that question. I haven't studied disinformation specifically, but we know that disinformation from Russia in particular has certainly played a role in Europe and in the United States, 2016. In 2020, it was more internal, domestic in the United States, and coming from Donald Trump. The disinformation is one of the biggest threats, and the lie about election fraud is one of the biggest threats to US democracy today. And okay, I think why did we choose Hungary, the comparison? My colleagues are in Hungary, and it was one of our cases anyway. And we wanted to see if a newer democracy like Hungary had the same, if we saw polarization working the same, because in the qualitative comparative study, we saw these same dynamics in established democracies, new democracies, rich democracies, poor democracies, the same dynamic. And so we wanted to see, okay, now if we go down to the micro level, do we see it operating the same? And we do.
Great. So let's see. So I can ask, I'm going to go to Marcelia's question, and I think I can ask you also a follow-up question. So the other thing that seems to vary between Hungary and the US is the US is always a unique environment because of the bipartisan two-party system. And so I know that we have independence in the US, but in general, we conceive of the US case as a kind of an outlier case relative to a lot of other democracies where we have a multi-party system. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how, since you have this variation in Hungary versus the US, if you can talk about how does it, thinking about this issue of you talking about how it's a marginalized group coming to power or the perception of marginalized groups rising, how does that play out in societies such as Brazil, where we have multi-party systems and we have kind of power doesn't seem concentrated or as necessarily. So I'm just curious about if you can tease that out a little bit, because as an institution, obviously political parties are really important for us to understand what's happening to them. And we have a lot of discussion in Latin America about the institutional characteristics of political parties. So I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about that. And then what Marcelia's asking about is, she's saying, you remember the case of Venezuela. And so are you planning to go back to the Venezuelan case in your research? And if so, if you can elaborate. And then Venezuela is more she states, Venezuela is more polarized nowadays than in 2000, in your opinion. Is it? What could be a solution? And I guess that comes back to the policy implications of your research. And thinking about, since we see this pernicious polarization, we're worried about its impact for democratic erosion. What are some of the things that you think about? Because I was curious in when you presented your research in the experiments, you're asking about policies, right? So one would say, okay, so maybe you should hold off on policy reform or policy change because you alienate the other group. So, one of the questions you could kind of pose as a perplexing thing is, actually, in order to prevent these groups from rising and becoming very significant threats, you have to hold off from very far-reaching reforms in these countries. Because when you try to do something significant to change the tax structure or to do something that really is threatening to specific groups, that might actually be more destabilizing. So in that sense, kind of to ask you a conflicting question is, so we save democracy, but we have a democracy that really doesn't bring the benefits to representation in it. And how would you react to that, or how do you think about that in the policy implications? And then we can go back. I think there's some other questions coming in, but those are we can start with those, and then I see two more.
Okay, great. So yeah, these are big questions. So let's see. Bipartisan versus multi-party systems. Yes. What we see, even in, so I want to talk about Brazil separately after I give this answer. What we see is that even in multi-party systems, coalitions forming, and what we often see is that there is a divide. And so even in a Hungary with a multi-party system, Turkey with a multi-party system, it can, Venezuela, multi-party system, coalitions form, and it often becomes polarized around the incumbent. So it is either pro-incumbent versus anti-incumbent. And what that means when that happens is that it's often the incumbent may have their own party. Chavez had a coalition actually, but it may be one main party with some smaller, supportive parties. But on the opposition side, it can be multipolar. And it's very difficult often for those oppositions to unite because they can range from far left to far right. And there are internal rivalries. So in Venezuela, what we saw, even going back when we were trying to mediate 2002, 2003, the opposition structure, it was called the MUD at that time, Mesa de Unidad Democrática, and they had the Hey Cuatro, four political party chiefs at the top. We couldn't get them to come together in the same room. They were the opposition, coordinating, umbrella. Oh no, it was before that, it was the coordinadora. They wouldn't come because they had internal rivalries on how to talk about, how they're going to oppose Chavez. So this is a common problem in polarized societies. When you have the polarizing figure in office, and particularly when they are autocratizing, you need to be able to unite the opposition to resist that autocratization. But that's very, very difficult. And another lesson that I've drawn also, and was kind of telling people in the United States, learning from Venezuela and others, opposition parties should be very careful not to demonize the supporters of that polarizing figure, that leader at the top. Because if you say, there was a lot of talk when Trump was first elected, oh, everyone who voted for Trump is racist. Said, you don't want to go there, because then you're insulting them, you're driving them away, and it's not true anyway. They're not all racist. But then when you need to draw some of those supporters into your coalition to fight anti-democratic moves, you're not going to get them. So this was a common problem. This was a problem for a long time with the Venezuelan opposition, is not only the internal rivalry, but the only thing that brought them together, and happens in many countries, is that they're anti the guy in power. So they're anti-Chavez, but they're not pro something else that's very clear. They don't agree on what they're in favor of, or they don't give that message. It's all anti. And so the people will resist voting for them if you're not making a better offer, or they'll just think back, well, these were the guys who used to be in power who didn't pay any attention to me. Why should I trust them now? They're not going to help me now. So that's a common problem. There is also, so even in multi-party systems, we see this happening. There's also some work now coming out, particularly by Europeans, to study affective polarization in multi-party systems, because the question is, how do you measure it? And the idea came from the United States political scientists, where it's very easy. You do these feeling thermometers. Do you feel warm or cold toward Democrats and Republicans? And then you can just compare. Well, if you have multi-parties, that's more difficult to do. So there are different formulas that people are developing. I, with a graduate student, developed one in that first volume that I showed you, The American Behavioral Scientist. If any of you are interested, we developed what we thought was the best measure to measure what we called mass partisan polarization of a country that can be a multi-party country. And we're looking at measuring how do you feel, how does the voter, the respondent, feel about the party they feel closest to, and then how many parties, which parties would you never vote for? It can be multiple. And then we have a formula to combine those to see how polarized is a country. So you could look at that. So in terms of Brazil, I just want to say the problem that I think that my colleagues, my Brazilianist scholar colleagues were saying, that what I've seen from what I know of Brazil, just being a Latin Americanist, is, you know, the parties are really weak and are, you know, this relationship, any president that comes in never has a majority and has to, you know, buy off congressmen, and switching parties was very easy. So you always had these fluid coalitions and a lot of incentives for corruption. So institutional incentives, and that's another key part of overcoming this. And so the question is, so what does that mean for future? So there's another book by Thomas Carruthers and Andrew O'Donoghue that also, they did at the same time that we were working on ours, and they have case studies that include Brazil. And in fact, I can tell you the author, the book, where is it? Okay, it's this book, Democracies Divided. And the Brazilian case study is by Umberto Mignosetti and Matias Spector. And basically they're saying, you know, Brazil resisted some of this polarization in part because of the institutional framework and this really kind of fragmented political party system. Same in Indonesia. So it can be that the dispersion of power in a fragmented political party system can help to prevent the polarization. But now, and again, I'm really curious to hear from you guys. Do you see it? And I would like to see, and I haven't been able to look at public opinion polls and stuff to see how polarized, is there a pro and anti-Bolsonaro polarization, you know, emerging in Brazil like we've seen in the other countries around these. Okay, so then Marcelia, the Venezuelan case, is it more polarized now than 2000? No, in some measures, no. First, Venezuela is now authoritarian, and I count it as being authoritarian beginning in 2016, when the Supreme Court nullified the National Assembly elections, the legislative election, in 3 cases that denied the opposition from their supermajority. So that was usurping the power. And then several steps since then. So I would count it first, it's now authoritarian. So what we're talking about is slightly different context today. The polarization is not, you know, in terms of opinion polls, both the opposition, if you look at Guaido, and Maduro on the one side, neither one has more than 15% approval rating. The opposition even has like 10% of people who identify partisan ID with it. And so it's people still, you know, kind of hate each other on those extremes, but they're not, the citizens are not identifying with the parties or the leaders like they were back in 2000, 2002, where it was strong polarization measured in any of these affective polarization terms. of liking your own party and disliking the other party. Now it's just, there's tremendous opposition to Maduro, so he doesn't have the pull that Chavez did. He relies on repression, but neither is their identity with the current opposition. And so there's this really huge, there were always, if you remember the Ninis, they called them, there's always the center in Venezuela that didn't identify with others during the conflict, but now it's really huge. So we can't say it's the same in that sense, but it is certainly still very divided. And the solution there is a different kind of solution, because we're talking about how to recover democracy, but also how to recover, it's a humanitarian crisis, a social crisis, and it's a failed state, basically. So it's a different kind of situation. We could talk about it more probably offline, but I think that first, it has to be a negotiated solution. It's going to have to involve the U.S. Probably because sanctions are the one thing that Maduro's interested in reducing, and that involves the U.S. And what I think is the opposition simply has to recognize and acknowledge that their strategy of the last 4 years has failed, and the maximal strategy, and this is common too, that feeds polarization, becoming so conflictual, is when each side follows a maximal strategy to remove the other. That's this annihilate the enemy, remove the enemy. That's not going to happen when you have a country where there are supporters of both sides or of multiple sides. You have to find a mechanism for coexistence. So I prefer to I don't talk about regime change for Venezuela. I talk about coexistence. They need a model, they need negotiations, they need probably some kind of interim, joint, or transitional government to rebuild the institutions. Opposition needs to participate in elections to mobilize people, even if they can't win initially, but to mobilize people and to begin to build the program. And it's going to be sequential. It's not going to be all of a sudden Maduro's gone and opposition's in power. So that's sort of quickly on Venezuela. Will democratic reform threaten others and be more destabilizing? Okay, I want to share a screen that comes from the article that you guys read, which was a little bit further down. Sorry, let me find where am I in my I was on this one. Okay. Okay, let me just go to this chart. Okay. This chart gets at what you were asking, Lorena, about will democratic reform threaten others and be more destabilizing? So what we came up with, and this is what we're going to test, this is our theoretical presentation, and we want to test this now by looking at actual cases, okay? What we expect is that these are some options for oppositions. So opposition goals, strategies, and outcomes. Opposition goals, we see that oppositions often have either a preservative goal. They want to restore the status quo ante. That's particularly elites who were in power before. They want it to go back, be like it was. They want to be in charge again. Or oppositions could have a generative goal, such as basically developing a new social contract. If they follow the preservative goal, this is where we see this happening a lot. In a lot of our cases already, we saw this. The typical thing is to be reactive, and they have reciprocal polarization. They use the same axis of polarization, the same tactics and strategies. They're demonizing. They're doing the tit for tat. They're just reciprocating. This was in Venezuela. We saw this happening to some extent in the US when the Democrats, over the whole Supreme Court thing and getting rid of the filibuster, that was tit for tat. This doesn't work. What it does, here's the outcome. Here's the strategy, counterpolarization strategy, the reactive one. It deepens pernicious polarization, and it leads to these bad outcomes. Either government dysfunction or paralysis, which is US. Creeping authoritarianism under the incumbent, that was Venezuela, that was Turkey, that was Hungary. Or democratic collapse, this is Thailand, this is Egypt, and return of the old elites. Okay, so that's one choice. Or another reactive is more passive depolarization. They fail to confront or change the axis of polarization. You could think back to a case like Weimar Germany, and when some of the opposition simply joined Hitler's party, thinking they formed a coalition, an alliance, thinking that they were going to control Hitler. And instead, Hitler ended up controlling them. So they didn't confront his, obnoxious things. They went along with him, and it was bad. It's just another example would be Chile after Pinochet, with the Concertación and the adoption of the market policies, the neoliberal market policies, didn't address the underlying grievances of the inequality that had, given rise to Allende and the conflict in the first place. And what they did was they masked those underlying divisions and grievances. They suspended the elite polarization. And so in that case, they ended up weakening democracy by masking it. And now, 30 years later, now it's coming out in Chile with the protest over the last decade and then over the last 2 years. So the second strategy, the generative, we see it as more proactive. And here I'm going to give you, so the transformative repolarization is what you were talking about, Lorena. And here I want to say this would be the United States election last year, I thought was a great test of this. This would be Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. These are the candidates coming in, big structural change. We have to reform democracy. We have to reform the social contract. We have to address inequality, big change. And this is where we're saying transformative repolarization, where you have a pro-democratic axis of polarization. I'd be interested if this might happen in Brazil. Can you polarize around democratic values? And in a way, this is happening in the United States today as we're proposing, because the backlash we saw to the Democrats winning in November in the United States today is a whole series of voting restrictions being passed by Republican state legislatures. And the Democrats in Congress are trying to pass this big voting expansion bill, which they're saying is going to reform democracy. But we are polarized around it, yes. And so this is the trick, is we think that a new party coming into office, new leaders, new party could follow this or challenge an incumbent by this pro-democratic axis of polarization. It might reduce polarization if and when they can get these reforms in place. And so it could be economic reforms, social reforms, but also democracy reforms, if they can successfully do this, because it's going to address the underlying grievances of people and begin to reduce the polarization. And that could slow or reverse autocratization. Now, the alternative, what I saw was the Joe Biden candidacy, active depolarization. He was going to be the unifier, right? He's going to do everything bipartisan consensus in Congress. It's reestablish cross-cutting ties. That's this strategy. This is the strategy of uniting the opposition. So in Hungary and in Turkey, in the mayoral races last year, oppositions finally united. And in Turkey, the campaign strategy was radical love. And So that would be an example of active depolarization. And we think that that can slow or reverse autocratization too, especially at local levels. So what's happening right now, and to answer your question, Lorena, could it be threatening? It depends on how it's presented, this transformative, the democratic reform, and to be inclusive. And it's very tricky because if the other side, and here we have in the US, Donald Trump still saying there was election fraud, and a lot of his supporters still believing it, the disinformation, then it's very difficult to convince them of any kind of inclusive strategy. But Biden has surprised me and many. He's coming out, he's moving from active depolarization to transformative. I think he's trying to be a transformative president, and he's proposed big bills, not just the democracy actually wasn't his proposal. That was the Democrats already there. But on infrastructure, where he's including, it's really much bigger. It's not bridges and roads. It is providing broadband access to the rural poor who don't have it. I mean, I've been teaching online this last year, and I realize we're much more like a developing country. We do not have, many of my students did not have good access. I had students riding their bicycle to a McDonald's to sit outside to get internet connection because they didn't have it in their house when they went back home during the pandemic. So yeah, the US has a lot of problems. Biden's trying to address this inequity. And the last thing I want to say about this is social justice can be a big thing. In the United States, as you know, racial justice is a huge problem. And this was another finding in our research that I hadn't mentioned, what we called formative rifts. If a country is polarized around a debate that is an unresolved historic debate from the country's founding, then the pernicious polarization will be more entrenched and more deep than any other issue. So in the United States, we say that was racial justice, and it's often a question of citizenship. Who is a rightful citizen in a country? In religious countries, it might be about religious rights and religious citizenship. In the United States, it was about race, Native Americans and African slaves. And of course, women also weren't given the same rights. So that has from time to time, cyclically in the United States, come back into very polarizing periods over the last 200 years. And today, that is one of them. Until we address that, we will not escape this cycle of pernicious polarization. And I think that the Biden-Harris administration and the Democrats, this may finally be the time when the United States is going to address it head on. Okay. I'll stop there with those answers and we can go on.
Great. Okay, so we've had a really rich discussion. And even though we've been talking about the US, it has a lot of symmetries with conversations about Brazil. And I think really interesting parallels. So we have another comment that came in is, this was a really interesting presentation. How important do you feel the participants' knowledge of constitutional issues is for them to meaningfully respond to the scenarios in the study? You briefly mentioned a legitimate Supreme Court action which could be misinterpreted if the political actors are assumed to be acting in bad faith. Does a knowledge and allowing them to see the difference between undemocratic bias and legitimate constitutional action have any importance here? That's one question. And the other comment, just to reverberate, is another comment is that, and I think you've given a lot of insights into this already, is about anti-polarization strategies for Brazil, which we really need in this moment. So maybe, I think you've talked a little bit about that, but if I could push you a little bit, the research right now, and obviously we can't pick when we do the field research we do, but it was conducted during the pandemic in the US in a really tough year, right? And so I guess if you could talk a little bit about, is that exceptional? Is what you're talking about the Biden administration and the change we're seeing, is it a result of the pandemic, or is it a result of polarization, pernicious polarization? So what is producing the transformation in the US that you see? And I think that also speaks to a little bit about what we can think about in other contexts of countries that have equally difficult context. But I think that's the big overarching questions, and then we can kind of end there because we've had a really rich discussion, and I feel like we've asked you a lot of questions, but so I think we can close with those two questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's a good question about the first one, the participants' knowledge. What we did in the survey was we gave them an introduction to each question, and particularly that one on the Supreme Court. We said at the beginning of the question, the U.S. Constitution does not determine how many Supreme Court justices, and in fact, the number has been changed several times by the Congress in U.S. history. So we gave them that background because we didn't think they would know it, and we did that on a couple of questions that we thought they may not know. So that's a really good question. Anti-polarization strategies. Okay, I'm going to go back to share this because I think the rest of this presentation, some of this, so this was in the democratization article. I also gave you, I don't know if you shared it, but there's another article from Journal of Democracy called Overcoming Polarization. And that one is going to be translated into Portuguese. I was told it was chosen to be in, it is this first one here on this slide. It's chosen to be in the Portuguese language Journal of Democracy. And I'm not sure when it's coming out, but it just came out January this year here in the US, Journal of Democracy. This article kind of summarizes a lot of our research to date. So I'm just going to show you 6 lessons about how to overcome pernicious polarization. This is from our qualitative research, and we want to be deepening this, as I said, in our next book project, which will take us probably a couple of years that we're just starting. But what we know so far is that the underlying grievances, the unresponsive political institutions that precede polarizing politics. Okay, so it's not just the grievances, but unresponsive political institutions. And here I would refer you to Sherry Berman, who writes about Europe, who said the technocratic illiberalism of Europe, also kind of the collusion of political parties, the removal, the unresponsive political institutions of the EU Commission and the governments that were seen as technocratic, not responding, can also produce a populist response. She was talking about populism. But if citizens are seeing, unresponsive political institutions, that was like Chavez, it gives them support for somebody coming in. So Bolsonaro, for sure. I mean, in Brazil, you had political institutions that were failing the people and not addressing corruption. And so, of course, somebody like Bolsonaro can come in. So these things precede polarizing politics. So you have to acknowledge these governance failures and lack of responsiveness as a first step in reversing polarization. Second lesson, polarization around formative rifts. I just talked about that already. And to sustain depolarization, we're going to have to address it. Otherwise, it's not going to last. Lesson 3, polarization changes institutions as incentives change. And accountability mechanisms become politicized. Okay, so what that means is when countries polarize, then half of the population is going to trust the institutions while the other half doesn't. So we saw this can come at the very beginning. So in Venezuela, at the beginning, Chavez only trusted the military. He didn't have control over the courts. He didn't have control over the bureaucracy. He didn't have control over the Congress when he first came into power. He only trusted the military or the media. He didn't control the media, any of it. And so he distrusted all of the rest of this, and his supporters began to distrust it. Now, after about 5 years, when he was able to start gaining control over all of those institutions and politicizing them, then it switched, and the other half didn't trust any of those institutions. So when institutions under polarization, they often, whoever's in power will politicize, even if the courts, the judiciary was independent, they will politicize. They will politicize the military. They will politicize bureaucracies, putting in loyalists rather than, promoting based on merit. And so as they become politicized, then the accountability mechanisms that exist, whether it is an impeachment process in the United States, whether it's courts, whether it's a anti-corruption agency, they will no longer work because they themselves are polarized. Perceptions about them are polarized. So the institutional reforms are needed to disincentivize partisan attempts to install permanent majorities or minorities and address the crisis of representation. So this is what we see as the solution. We have to look at what is the logic of your constitution, your institutions. And the example for the United States is our Constitution with the Electoral College, that weird thing that we have. So we have indirect elections, and our Senate, and this is the same in Brazil, gives disproportionate representation to rural areas or states that are less populous, smaller population. And so that means that the party now in the United States, I said polarization was a long time coming. It came in part because the political parties used to be kind of evenly spread over rural areas and cities. Today, they're not. The parties have sorted, the people have sorted into parties. So the Republican Party is stronger in the rural areas and the Democratic Party stronger in the cities. And that means that our institutions incentivize the Republican Party to try to rule as a minority party because they will not get majority vote. But they have the advantage in the Senate and in the Electoral College, the way it's set up, that they can win because they have a disproportionate representation. And so that's why Republicans 3 times in the last 20 years have lost the popular vote and won the Electoral College for president. So we need to change these incentives, which would be changing the Electoral College, changing the Senate, ideas like giving Washington, D.C. representation, things like that. So every country, so you could look at this for Brazil, what are the institutional incentives? And then usually populists are going to come in and try and install a permanent majority with gerrymandering, with electoral reforms that will give them a permanent majority. Okay, so Chavez did that, Erdogan did that, Orban did that. That's very common. Okay, number 4, opposition strategies can contribute to deepening pernicious polarization. Oh, this is the one I talked about when I showed you the chart. Okay, so these reactive ones, that's going to deepen pernicious polarization, or the generative ones, active depolarization, transformative, can help to overcome polarization. That was the chart that I talked about a few minutes ago. That chart. And then there's 2 more lessons. Oh, this is key. You guys got to think about this for Brazil too. Removing a polarizing leader alone is unlikely to disrupt the equilibrium of pernicious polarization or address the underlying grievances. Okay, so just because we got rid of Trump, really nothing has changed. That was your question. That was your last big question, Lorena. No, we're still very polarized. Biden is trying to be a transformative president. but he hadn't succeeded yet. So we're still very polarized. And I am very worried about the institutions in the United States and about our society being able to come back together as a cohesive society. We saw this, you think about, okay, Uribe in Colombia, polarizing, okay, removed him. Santos was supposed to be his successor. Same with Moreno in Ecuador, supposed to be successor. Okay, wow, they surprised their leaders. They reversed on them, right? Moreno went against Correa, Santos against Uribe. But Santos tried very hard to address the underlying grievances. So did Moreno. But they haven't succeeded yet because that polarizer is still in the background, is still fighting the peace accords in Colombia. And Uribe polarized around the peace accords. And Correa is trying to, come back in Ecuador. So we had a polarized election, just recently in Ecuador. So what we think is the manner in which the leader is removed will determine how difficult it would be to overcome the societal polarization. So if a leader is removed by means that are seen to be illegitimate by their supporters, if there's a coup, if there's a political impeachment, if there's a fraudulent election, if there's military intervention, then it's likely to extend polarization. So the manner in which the leader is removed. Now, the problem is, okay, they were removed. It was, Ecuador and Colombia, it was just elections. It was fine. The removal was not illegitimate. And so they would have a better chance to reduce the polarization. In the United States, Trump was removed by a fine election, but he claimed it was fraudulent. And so he is extending the polarization over that. If in other cases, removing, if in Brazil, those who view Dilma's impeachment as politicized, then that makes it more difficult to overcome it. Or in Paraguay, when they had the express impeachment a few years ago, that kind of thing. So it depends on the manner. And then the last one, political agency is key. This is not just a structural problem. Political agency, strategic choices of individuals matter. Do individual leaders, politicians, parties, and other actors, could be social movement leaders, can be corporate leaders, intellectual leaders, union leaders, do they prioritize long-term collective interest over short-term partisan interest? If they're prioritizing short-term partisan interest, then it's going to be very difficult. We also think political appeals to identities is bad, is going to continue to the polarization, versus political appeals to issues, which will help to reduce it. Divisive rhetoric appealing to emotions of anger and resentment is bad, versus unifying democracy-friendly narratives to mobilize a political base. Okay, so those are, and the last thing I had was innovative campaign strategies we could look at as well. There's some great examples. The Serbians, Otpor strategy against Milosevic in the 90s used humor. The radical love strategy I just mentioned in Istanbul last year. In Senegal, rappers used hip hop to pressure a government, to a leader, to not have, to remove term limits. And then social movements and civil society organizations can be allies in for political parties in innovating their campaigns. And beyond protest, social movements can change the agenda, and they can organize politically and build institutions. All right, so those were some of the ideas we've come up with so far.
Great. Jennifer, you've given a lot for us to think about. We're in such a difficult moment in Brazil. We have a humanitarian, we have a sanitary crisis that's really still very, very serious. And we have, you know, ongoing congressional hearings to that are taking place to assess the federal government's response and try to bring accountability. But we also have a moment, you know, the economic situation is very serious and very worrisome. And we're also watching the US in this moment. And it speaks to a lot of different things for us, right? So I think I want to thank you so much, because you've really provoked a lot of, like, you've given us hope, and you've given us warnings, and you've showed us all the different pathways we can go. And we're at this moment in Brazil of a crossroads where it's not really clear where we're going. But you've definitely given us a lot to think about.
Well, let me say one thing then on the pandemic. The pandemic as an example of a crisis should have been a depolarizing opportunity for both of our countries. It should have been. And at the very beginning in the US, the two parties came together to pass our first COVID relief bill. And, you know, it looked like for a moment they were going to work, and then they fell apart because the leaders, both Bolsonaro and Trump, had politicized the pandemic itself, and so made it a polarizing issue. So I think we share that, and that's the real shame. And that's I mean, it's so dangerous, and we've seen all the cost of that. But the other hopeful thing I want to tell you is what really worked in the United States too is really massive mobilization of voters. It was a lot of effort, particularly, you know, I'm in the state of Georgia. If you remember, it was our two senators.
Yes, you guys were key.
Made the balance. In spite of attempts to restrict voting, particularly of Blacks and racial minorities in Georgia, there was a tremendous mobilization effort to help educate voters and help them come out to vote. And that's really key too. You can't just, you know, give up in that sense. And social movements were important in that too.
Yes, yes, I absolutely agree.
And students were very important.
Yes. So here too, we're still trying to understand the impact of the local elections last year. And it's very important to try to also understand what happened locally, to try to think about what could potentially happen in the next election. But I agree with you. There's a really important turning point in Brazil as well. The first legislation Bolsonaro signs is actually in early February. In his statements, we didn't have a clue how much radical the response would be at the national level of the government, because initially we did pass legislation that was more responsive to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like we were learning, and we were going to be able to unite more around what was happening. But as the crisis has continued, it's difficult. And I think since you've done so much work on Latin America, we can't help thinking, as the US also emerges now in a very different world than the rest of the world is right now, it's also the very critical moment, because we see kind of where we could be. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
So many things. So thank you, Jennifer, so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Janina's saying your presentation was so interesting. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We really do hope that we can continue this conversation. We have so much we want to talk with you about in the future. So we really look forward to keeping abreast of your research and following your work, and hopefully welcoming you either physically or virtually again.
All right. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good night to everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.